The morning Harlan Voss rode up to her property, the sky above Redstone Valley had the color of old pewter, flat, cold, and unyielding. October in Colorado territory did not ease into itself. It arrived like a creditor demanding payment before you had finished your coffee. Wren Aldridge heard the hoofbeats before she saw the rider. She was standing at the dry sink, rinsing her hands in water that had gone cold overnight, and she recognized the particular rhythm of Voss's black gelding. Heavier in the left foreleg, always had been, ever since the animal slipped on the creek ice 2 winters back. A man who paid attention to horses would have had that fixed by now. Harlan Voss was not a man who paid attention to things that could not pay him back. She dried her hands on the rough cotton of her apron and walked to the front door. She did not rush. Rushing was a form of confession, and Wren Aldridge had nothing to confess. He came with 2 men. She had expected that. Harlan Voss never went anywhere alone that he considered official business because witnesses were part of his machinery. One was his ranch hand, a broad-shouldered young man named Decker, who stood slightly behind and to the left of his employer, the way a shadow behaves when the sun is coming from the right angle. The other was a man she recognized only vaguely, someone from the territorial council offices in Glenwood, by the look of his coat. Too clean for the valley, too pressed. Voss dismounted without hurry. He was 54 years old, thick through the chest and shoulders, with a face that the weather had worked on for decades until it had the texture of old harness leather. He had the kind of authority that does not need to announce itself, which is the most dangerous kind, because it has learned that silence communicates power more efficiently than volume. He pulled a folded document from the inside of his coat. Wren stepped onto this porch and stood with her arms loose at her sides. The morning air hit her face like a clean slap. She did not put her hands in her pockets. She did not cross her arms. She simply stood the way her father had taught her to stand in uncertain places, feet at shoulder width, weight evenly distributed, as though the ground beneath you was the most reliable thing in the world, even when you knew it might not be. Voss looked at her for a moment before he spoke. She understood that pause. It was a measurement. He was calculating whether she had spent the night crying, whether grief or isolation had softened her into something more manageable. What he saw in her face she could not know. But she watched something in his expression settle into a kind of professional disappointment. The way a man looks when the thing he was hoping would be easy turns out to require paperwork. He unfolded the document and read it aloud. Not because she was illiterate, but because reading it aloud made it a performance, and performances had witnesses. The language was precise and bureaucratic and designed to be overwhelming. The Territorial Council, in its concern for the safety of livestock and the security of settled communities, had issued an ordinance following the loss of 11 animals to predation over the preceding 2 weeks. Any livestock not secured within a registered fortified structure meeting the new minimum construction standards by the first significant hard freeze of the season would be subject to confiscation and transfer to the regional stage line operation. The standards were specific: timber framing of no less than 4 inches in thickness, a double wall perimeter, a registered lock mechanism on all entry points. He looked up from the paper. 3 horses, he said. He did not say it with cruelty. He said it the way an accountant reads a balance sheet, with the mild, impersonal tone of a man who has already done the arithmetic and found the outcome inevitable. Your 3 horses represent a documented attractant for the wolf pack currently ranging the northern grazing corridor. The presence of unsecured livestock in proximity to settled homesteads is a public safety matter under the new ordinance. You have 21 days to bring your arrangements into compliance with the minimum structural standard. After that period, the animals are subject to seizure. He refolded the document and held it out to her. She took it. Her fingers did not tremble. She was 31 years old, and she had learned by now that trembling was information you gave to other people, and she was very careful about what information she gave to Harlan Voss. He studied her face one more time, looking for the thing most men look for when they delivered news like this to a woman alone: the moment of collapse, the eyes going liquid, the shoulder dropping, the small internal crumbling that signaled the conversation was over and the outcome was settled. He did not find it. He put his foot in the stirrup and swung back onto his horse with the ease of a man who has done that particular motion 10,000 times. He looked down at her from the saddle, and his voice took on the tone of something almost like regret, though she knew it wasn't. 21 days, Mrs. Aldridge, he said. I'd suggest you start making arrangements. He turned the gelding and rode back down the track toward the main road. The two men following behind him and Wren stood on the porch and watched until the sound of the hoofbeats dissolved into the cold morning air. Then she looked down at the document in her hands. Then she looked at the ground. The practical mathematics of her situation were not complicated. They were simply brutal. A timber stable meeting, the Territorial Council's new minimum specifications required approximately 2,000 board feet of cured pine lumber, 400 pounds of iron hardware, and a crew of at least 6 experienced men working 14-hour shifts over the better part of 2 weeks. The nearest sawmill that could supply lumber of the required specification was in Carbondale, 23 miles to the northwest. The cost of the materials alone would be somewhere north of $60. The labor would double that. Wren Aldridge had $11.40 in the tin box she kept behind the loose stone in the chimney. She had 3 horses, a sturdy buckskin gelding she called Gideon, a bay mare named Pella, and a yearling colt that had not yet been named because Ben had died before the colt was born, and she had not been able to bring herself to name something so new in the months since. She had a cabin that was hers by right of the homestead claim she had maintained for 3 years on her own. She had a plow, 2 axes, a hand drill, a mattock, a long-handled iron spade, and a set of block and tackle that Ben had rigged from the ridgepole of the cabin for hauling game. She had no family within 400 miles. She had neighbors who were decent people under ordinary circumstances, which is to say they would help you pull a wagon out of the mud or sit with you through a fever. But who had learned over the preceding years that opposing Harlan Voss in matters that touched his commercial interests was not a survivable strategy for small operations in the Redstone Valley. He owned the water rights on the northern tributary. He controlled the contract for the stage line feed station. He had the ear of 2 of the 3 men who sat on the Territorial Council. This was not a dispute about wolves or structural standards or the safety of the community. Wren understood that clearly the way you understand the temperature of water when you put your hand into it. This was a mechanism designed to separate her from her horses, which were her only means of transportation, her only means of working the land, and the only practical argument she had for maintaining her homestead claim under territorial law. Without the horses, the claim collapsed. Without the claim, she had nothing that Harlan Voss could not eventually absorb into his expanding operation in the valley. She had 21 days. She folded the document carefully and went inside. On the second morning, she drove the wagon into Redstone. The town was not large, a main street of packed earth, a general store, a blacksmith shop, a land office, a small building that served as both the post office and the council's local administrative outpost, and a scattering of structures that were in various states of being either finished or slowly returning to lumber. The mountains stood to the west, wearing their first permanent snow of the season on the high peaks, and the aspens along the creek had gone entirely to gold. She went to the sawmill first. The man who ran it was named Orrin Fitch, and he was not unkind. He was a practical man who had built his operation on credit relationships and the understanding that credit relationships required reliable repayment. He looked at her the way men in his position always looked at her, with the particular combination of sympathy and regret that people deploy when they are about to decline a request without wanting to feel responsible for the consequences. She told him what she needed. He quoted her a price. She told him what she had. He was quiet for a moment, running the arithmetic she already knew, and then he told her he couldn't extend her credit on an order that size without some form of collateral security that she did not have. She asked him one other question, and it was not the question he expected. She asked him what depth the frost line ran to in this part of the valley. How far down before the ground stopped freezing in a hard winter? He stared at her. She asked again, explaining that she wanted to know the practical working depth, the point at which the soil maintained a stable temperature year-round. He scratched the back of his neck and said he reckoned it was around 18 to 24 inches in a normal winter, maybe a hair deeper in a hard one. Below that, the ground stayed somewhere around 55 degrees, more or less. That was why root cellars worked. Stable temperature. He had built one himself behind the mill, and the turnips came out of it in March in better condition than they went in. She thanked him and left. He watched her go with the expression of a man who has just answered a question he doesn't quite understand, which is a feeling that stays with you. She went to the bank next. The conversation there was shorter and arrived at the same destination. Then she went to the general store and purchased with careful precision 3 items: a small tin of tallow, a bundle of good candles, and a coil of measuring twine. Total outlay 62 cents. On her way out of town, she passed the blacksmith shop. Cormac Whitmore was working at the forge, his back to the street, the rhythmic clang of hammer on iron marking time in the cold air. He was 58 years old, gray-haired with forearms that looked like they had been carved from something harder than ordinary wood. He had been the blacksmith in Redstone for 22 years. He knew every ranch and every rancher in the valley. He was a man who believed in the order of things, not because the order was always just, but because he had seen what happened in places where the order broke down, and he had decided that imperfect order was preferable to honest chaos. He turned as she passed and they exchanged a nod. Nothing more. He watched her drive out of town with the look of a man filing away an observation for later reference. She did not go back to town after that. In the days that followed, her neighbors who passed along the road that ran below her property saw what they expected to see: a woman moving slowly through her days, tending to small tasks, carrying modest loads. No stacks of timber appeared in her yard. No crew of hired men arrived with tools and noise. The skeleton of a regulation stable did not begin to rise against the autumn sky. What they saw was a woman bringing small wheelbarrow loads of earth to the bank of the creek that ran behind her property in the gray light of late afternoon, when the mist came up off the water and softened the edges of everything. They saw this 2 or 3 times on days when the road was quiet, and they interpreted it without much difficulty. She was cleaning up. She was putting things in order. She was preparing to leave. This interpretation settled into the community the way a stone settles into soft ground, with a small disturbance at first and then with increasing permanence. Wren Aldridge had been a fixture of quiet stubbornness in the valley for 3 years, and people had respected that stubbornness without entirely believing in it. Now it appeared that even she had done the arithmetic and found the same answer everyone else had already found. They felt sorry for her. Some of them felt relieved. Both emotions are easier when the outcome is already decided. What they did not see was what happened inside the cabin. On the 4th evening after Harlan Voss's visit, when the last light had gone from the sky and the temperature had dropped enough to make the air feel like something physical pressing against the glass of the windows, Wren moved the rug from the center of the main room. Beneath it were the wide pine floorboards that Ben had laid in the 3rd year of their marriage, fitted with care, sanded smooth, a domestic gesture from a man who was not given to many domestic gestures. She knelt and ran her hands along the seams between the boards. She found the two she was looking for slightly wider gap than the others near the center of the room, and she worked the blade of her hunting knife into the seam and levered them up. Beneath was darkness and the smell of old earth. Cool, dry mineral, the smell of depth. She lowered a candle on a length of twine. The light fell 8 feet before it reached the bottom, a floor of dense clay, pale and compressed, undisturbed since the cabin was built. She could see the underside of the foundation stones at the perimeter, where Ben had stacked limestone in dry courses to raise the cabin floor above the grade. The clay was hard. It had not cracked. It had not shifted. 3 years of frost and thaw above it, and it sat there with the absolute patience of material that does not experience time the way living things do. She pulled the candle back up and sat on the floor of her cabin with her knees drawn up, and she thought about her father. Devlin Aldridge had been a Cornish miner, which meant he had been born into a particular relationship with the earth that was not mystical or sentimental, but deeply technical. His people had been pulling copper and tin out of the ground in Cornwall for 200 years before he was born, and the knowledge of how to do that, how to read stone, how to shore up a tunnel, how to manage the air in a space below ground, so that a man could breathe in it without dying, was not something he had learned from books. It was something that had been handed down through generations of men who had understood that the earth was not an adversary to be conquered, but a medium to be read. He had brought that knowledge to Pennsylvania, where he worked the copper mines, until his lungs began to give him trouble. And then he had moved west, and then he had died in a small house in Ohio, when Wren was 17, still carrying in his chest the fine rock dust of 20 years underground. But before that, when she was 12, he had taken her into the mine with him. She remembered the weight of the air, the way the temperature changed the moment you went below the surface, not cold exactly, but even. Stable. The same in July as in December, the same at noon as at midnight. Her father had explained it to her in the careful, specific language he used for things that mattered. The earth is a heat engine, Ellie, he had said, using the name he had called her since she was small. It generates its own warmth from its own mass, and that warmth moves upward toward the surface. But it moves slowly, so slowly that the surface sees all the seasons, while the deep earth sees none of them. Get far enough down and you find a place the frost can't reach and the sun doesn't touch. A place of constant temperature. 55 degrees, more or less, winter or summer, night or day. That's where we worked down in the even place. He had shown her the timbering of the tunnels, how the frames were set not to hold the earth back by brute force, but to redirect its pressure to use the weight of what was above to lock the structure in place rather than to crush it. An inverted arch, he explained, does not push outward against the earth. It pushes inward, and the earth accepts that. The earth and the arch achieve an agreement. Then he had shown her the air system. Every mine needed air. Men breathed, candles burned. Without circulation, a tunnel became a tomb in hours. But moving air through underground space without powered machinery required an understanding of pressure and temperature that was genuinely elegant in its simplicity. Warm air rises, cool air falls. If you built your intake and your exhaust at different elevations, and if you maintained a heat source at the right point in the system, the air moved itself. It didn't need to be pushed, it needed to be invited. She had not thought about those lessons for years. Now sitting on the floor of her cabin with her hands flat on the boards and the cold of the earth moving up faintly through the pine, she thought about nothing else. She spent 2 nights doing the calculations. She worked by candlelight at the kitchen table using the back of the paper that the ordinance had been written on because she had very little paper and she was not going to waste it on sentiment. The footprint of the cabin was 24 feet by 18 feet, resting on its limestone perimeter. The clay beneath descended 8 feet before it reached the bedrock shelf that underlay the whole of that section of the valley. The frost line, as Orrin Fitch had told her without knowing why she asked, ran to 2 feet in a hard winter. That left 6 feet of stable, workable earth below the frost line and above the bedrock. To house 3 horses comfortably, she needed a space 12 feet wide and 20 feet long, with a ceiling clearance of at least 7 feet. That was a volume of approximately 1,680 cubic feet of earth to be removed. She sat with that number for a long time. 1,680 cubic feet. Moved by one woman, one spade, and a modified wheelbarrow in whatever hours of darkness and fog she could work without being observed. Carried in loads of perhaps 2 to 3 cubic feet at a time, scattered along the creek bank in quantities small enough not to be noticed against the natural sediment. She did the arithmetic on how many loads that was. She did the arithmetic on how long it would take. It was possible. It would cost her something close to everything she had. But it was possible. She turned the paper over and began drawing. The stable would sit beneath the center of the cabin floor, accessible through a hatch in the main room. The access ramp would spiral from a concealed entrance in the brush 30 yards behind the cabin, descending gradually to the chamber level. The ramp floor would be lined with compacted sand and pine needles to muffle the sound of hooves. The ventilation was the critical element, and she spent the most time on it. The air intake would run as a buried stone conduit from a point 50 feet from the cabin, allowing incoming air to be pre-warmed by the Earth's constant temperature before it reached the horses. The exhaust was more complex. She would not use a vertical chimney. Vertical chimneys broadcast what they carry. Instead, the exhaust conduit would run horizontally underground and connect to the existing cabin chimney behind a series of stone baffles she would build into the back of the fireplace. The warm breath of 3 horses would rise through the system, be pulled by the natural draft of her evening fire, and be burned or masked by the smoke of oak and pine before it reached the open air. The wolves would find nothing. Their primary tool was their nose, and she was going to take their nose away from them. She sat back and looked at the drawing. Her father would have appreciated the geometry of it. Ben would have called it impossible and been partially right, because the part that made it possible was a kind of knowledge he had never had access to, not through any fault of his own. He had been a man of surfaces. He had seen the earth as something to be settled on, built upon, controlled from above. It was the only way he knew how to see it, and it had served him reasonably well until it hadn't. Wren had grown up underground. She knew the earth differently. She folded the drawing, put it in the tin box with the money, and went to bed. She started the following evening. She waited until dark, full dark, not just dusk, and then she moved the rug, lifted the boards, and dropped the first bucket into the hole. The sound it made when it hit the clay was a soft, definite thud. Not an echo. The earth absorbed it. She lowered herself after the bucket on a length of knotted rope and stood on the floor of the space below her cabin, and she held up the candle and she looked at what she had to work with. The clay was pale and dense and cold to the touch, with the faint mineral smell that she associated with deep, undisturbed earth. The limestone foundation stones ran along the perimeter above her head, fitted dry, wedged in place by their own weight and the weight of what sat on them. The underside of the pine floorboards was dark with age and the accumulated breath of a household. She set the candle in a lump of its own tallow to hold it upright, picked up the mattock, and began. The clay was not easy material. It did not break apart the way loose soil does. It had to be cut angled strokes of the mattock to fracture it, then the spade to lever out the pieces, then hands to break the larger chunks into manageable sizes for the bucket. It was slow rhythmic work, the kind that requires you to stop thinking about the total distance and start thinking only about the next stroke. Her father had told her that once too about tunnel work. You don't dig a mine, Ellie. You dig the next foot of the mine. The rest takes care of itself. She worked for 4 hours that first night and removed perhaps 30 cubic feet of earth. She hauled it up in the bucket, transferred it to the wheelbarrow, covered the wheelbarrow with an old canvas, and left it until morning. In the pre-dawn, when the mist was thick along the creek and the road was quiet, she moved the load in a single trip to the creek bank and scattered it along the cut bank where the water had already deposited similar sediment. By the time the sun was fully up and the mist had burned off, there was nothing to see. She went back inside, replaced the boards, laid the rug back down, and started the fire for breakfast. From the outside, the cabin looked exactly as it always had. By the end of the first week, her hands had changed. The skin across her palms and the base of her fingers had gone through the phase of blistering and had begun the slower process of rebuilding itself as something harder and less sensitive. She worked through the discomfort in the way that physical work demands, not by ignoring the pain, but by incorporating it into the rhythm of the task, the way a limp becomes a gait if you carry it long enough. On the 8th day, Cormac Whitmore rode up to the cabin in the mid-morning. He dismounted with the ease of a man who had spent his whole life getting on and off horses, tied the animal to the fence post near the gate, and walked up to where she was hanging laundry on the line she had strung between the cabin corner and the big ponderosa at the edge of the yard. The laundry was genuine. She had learned very early that the best cover for unusual activity is the faithful performance of ordinary activity. He stood with his hat in his hands and told her he had come by to see how she was getting on. His tone was not unkind. It carried the specific weight of a man who wants to be decent while also being honest, which is a difficult combination to carry for long distances. He told her he had driven past the sawmill and had not seen any lumber tagged for her order. She told him there was no lumber order. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the row of shirts and work trousers she had hung on the line. Then he looked at the flat ground around the cabin where there was no evidence of excavation, no piles of material, no tools left out. He told her that if she needed help making arrangements for the horses for the property, for wherever she might be going, he could probably facilitate an introduction to someone in Carbondale who dealt in livestock. He said it with the careful gentleness of a man who has already concluded that the outcome is settled and is trying to mitigate the human cost of it. She thanked him. She told him the horses were not for sale. He put his hat back on and stood there for another moment, as though waiting for information that would make the situation more comprehensible to him. She gave him none. He nodded, said he hoped she'd be comfortable through the winter, and rode away. That evening she had confirmation of something she had suspected. Cormac Whitmore, in his role as the community's informal institutional memory, would file an honest report of what he had observed. He would tell Harlan Voss that there was no construction activity at the Aldridge property. No lumber, no crew, no framework rising. Harlan Voss would hear this and conclude that the matter was settling itself without further effort on his part. He would loosen his attention. He would direct his thinking toward other concerns. That was exactly what she needed him to do. On the 9th night, the first arch collapsed. She had been building a test section of the vaulted ceiling, dry-stacked limestone, the same material that made up the cabin's foundation, sourced from the loose rubble along the base of the cliff face, a quarter-mile east of the property. She had been working on the arch for 3 nights, fitting the stones by candlelight, testing each one for fit and seating before she committed to its position. She had the keystone in her hands when she heard the sound, a low, gritty shifting, like something clearing its throat. And then the entire structure came down in a slow, heavy cascade, filling the floor of the excavation with rubble and raising a cloud of pale clay dust that extinguished the candle. She stood in the darkness for a long moment, tasting dust, her hand still holding the keystone. Then she set it down carefully on the rubble. She climbed out, relit the candle from the lamp on the kitchen table, and went back down. In the candlelight, she looked at what had fallen. She picked up the first stone nearest her and turned it in her hands, running her thumb along the angle of the face. She found the problem in less than a minute. The skew angle of the Springer stones, the base stones that transferred the arch's load into the walls, had been set at too shallow a pitch. The outward thrust of the arch had nothing to grip against. When she had added weight to the keystone position, the Springers had simply walked outward, and the whole thing had come down. She understood the correction immediately. She set the stone down, picked up the next one, and began again. She worked for 4 hours. Not because she was angry, not because she was afraid, but because the problem was clear and the solution was available, and she had the stones and the time and the knowledge to fix it. Her father had taught her that a failed arch was not a failure of the idea. It was information about the execution. The second arch went up stone by stone, each Springer set at the correct angle, each course checked before the next went on. When she set the keystone the second time, she pressed upward against it with the heels of both hands and felt it lock into position with a solidity that was different in character from anything she had felt in the first attempt. Not just weight, but intention. The arch was not merely sitting there. It was working, distributing load outward and downward through the Springer stones into the wall, which distributed it into the clay, which distributed it into the earth. The more weight you put on it from above, the tighter it would hold. She climbed out just before dawn, moved the rubble from the failed first attempt to the creek bank in 2 careful loads, and was back inside with the floor restored and the fire laid before the first gray light came over the eastern ridge. She did not need anyone to tell her she could do this. She already knew. The arch had told her. There was one more thing she needed to understand before she could commit the design to execution, and it was the thing that determined whether the entire project was viable or merely clever. On the 12th evening, she brought a small handful of horsehair into the chamber taken from Gideon's tail, where he wouldn't miss it, and built a tiny fire of it in a clay pot in the far corner of the excavated space. The hair burned with the distinctive sharp animal smell that was the specific signature of living horses, the smell that a wolf's nose was built to detect from a mile away in still air. Then she climbed out, sealed the hatch, and stood in the cold outside air for 20 minutes. She stood downwind. She stood upwind. She circled the cabin and stood on each side of it, turning her face into the air. Nothing. Not a trace of the smell reached her at the surface. The system of baffles and the draw of the fireplace were doing what she had calculated they would do. The air moving through the underground space was being filtered through the Earth's own mass in the intake and cleaned by fire in the exhaust. She stood in the dark outside her cabin for a long moment after the 20 minutes were up. She knew then, not hoped, not believed, knew with the particular cold certainty that comes when mathematics and physical reality arrive at the same answer simultaneously. She went inside. She put the kettle on. She sat at the table in the warmth of the fire and drank her coffee, and did not say anything to anyone because there was no one to say anything to. But she sat with a stillness that was different from the stillness of grief or loneliness, which were the stillnesses she was most familiar with. This was the stillness of a problem that had been solved. Outside the cabin window, the aspens had finished their gold and were standing bare against the sky, and the high peaks to the west were carrying more snow than they had been carrying a week ago, and the cold was beginning to develop the particular quality that old-timers in the valley described as meaning business. 21 days had seemed like very little. It had turned out to be enough, but only just. The 14th day arrived with a sky the color of iron filings low and pressed against the valley like a lid someone had set down too hard. Wren was already underground when the light came up. She had developed a rhythm by then. Not the rhythm of someone who had found the work easy, but the rhythm of someone who had found the only sustainable pace for work that was going to kill her if she miscalculated the margin. 4 hours in the morning before the road woke up. A surface interval of 3 hours in which she did the visible things, fed the horses, split wood for the stove, hung laundry, moved purposefully around the yard in the way a woman getting on with her day moves. Then another 4 hours in the late afternoon when the mist came up off the creek and softened the light to the point where a wheelbarrow moving along the back fence line was just a shape in the gray interpretable as anything. She had removed by her calculations somewhere between 400 and 450 cubic feet of clay in the first 13 days. She needed to remove 1,680. The arithmetic was unforgiving. She needed to nearly double her pace in the remaining time. She adjusted the pace. The physical accounting of what this cost her was not something she spent time thinking about, because thinking about it was a form of spending it twice. Her hands had moved past the raw stage and into something more durable. the palms calloused in specific places that corresponded exactly to where the handles of the mattock and the spade made contact during the particular strokes of underground work. Her shoulders had found new muscle in the trapezius and the posterior deltoid that she had not known she was building until she reached for a high shelf one morning and understood that her arms were a different instrument than they had been a month ago. She ate carefully and methodically more than she wanted to, less than she probably needed, but calibrated against the $11.40 that was her entire material reserve. Oats, dried beans, salt pork when she could make it stretch. An egg when one of the three remaining hens cooperated. She was not hungry in the way that people who have never managed real scarcity understand hunger. She was running at a precisely calculated caloric deficit that she could sustain for the required period without her hands losing their grip or her calculations losing their accuracy. Those were her two instruments, her hands and her mind. Everything else was secondary. On the 17th day, Cormac Whitmore came by a second time. He came in the early evening just as the mist was beginning its rise off the creek. She saw him coming up the track and had enough time to confirm that the hatch was sealed and the rug was in place before he knocked. She opened the door and invited him in because refusing would have been its own kind of information. He came in and stood by the door, hat in hand again, and looked around the room with the careful, non-intrusive attention of a man who has trained himself over decades to observe without appearing to observe. It was a professional habit. A blacksmith sees the condition of tools and hardware the way a doctor sees the condition of a body, not intrusively, just automatically, the practiced eye cataloging information that the untrained eye walks past. She put the kettle on. He said he had been talking to Orrin Fitch at the sawmill. He said Orrin had mentioned her visit in the question she had asked about the frost line, and that he had found the question interesting enough to mention in passing. She poured water into the kettle and set it on the stove and said that she had been curious about root cellar construction. He said that was a reasonable thing to be curious about. She said she thought so too. He sat down at the table when she gestured to the chair and put his hat on his knee and was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire in the stove. The fire was modest, just enough to take the chill off the room, not the aggressive burn she had been using in the evenings when the ventilation system needed its draw. She had calibrated the fire for a social call, which told you something about how carefully she was managing the variables. He told her that Harlan Voss had asked him to stop by. Not officially, just to check on things, to see how she was settling her affairs. She set 2 cups on the table. She told him she appreciated the concern. He said that was not exactly what he meant. He said that Harlan had been expecting to see some movement on the property by now, some sign of either construction or preparation to relocate. He said that the absence of either had made Harlan curious in a way that Cormac found it professionally advisable to get ahead of. The kettle began to move. She brought it to this table and poured, and then she sat down across from him and wrapped her hands around her cup and looked at him directly, which was something she had learned made people uncomfortable in a useful way. She told him she had the situation in hand. He looked at her over the rim of his cup. He was not a stupid man. He was a man who had organized his life around institutional reliability, around the idea that the rules existed for reasons, and that working within them, even imperfect rules made by imperfect people, was the thing that kept a community from dissolving into a set of competing individual interests that would eventually consume each other. He believed this the way some men believe in God, not naively, not without awareness of the contradictions, but with the settled conviction of someone who has looked at the alternative and found it worse. But he was also, underneath the institutional habit, an honest man. And honest men, when they are sitting across a table from someone who is clearly doing something they don't understand, have a tell. The tell is that they stop asking questions. He stopped asking questions. He drank his coffee and talked about the weather coming in off the peaks, about the hard winter being predicted, about 2 of the Grafton family's young horses that had been taken by the wolf pack 3 nights back on the north grazing land. He talked about the new ordinance and whether it was going to hold up under territorial review. He talked about the price of iron rod coming out of Denver, which had gone up again, which was going to make the spring fencing season unpleasant for everyone. And then he put his cup down and set his hands flat on the table and said quietly that he hoped she knew what she was doing. She told him she did. He nodded once, put his hat on, stood up. He was almost to the door when he stopped. She watched his back, the set of his shoulders, the way a man's body telegraphs the moment of decision. He turned around. He told her that he had written in his report to Voss that the property showed no signs of construction activity and no signs of livestock relocation. He told her this was an accurate account of what he had observed. He told her he intended to keep reporting accurately on what he observed. There was a weight in the way he said it that she understood was an offer of a particular kind. Not complicity, not protection. Something more careful than either of those. He was telling her that he would only ever report what his eyes could verify. He was telling her that the boundary of his authority was the boundary of his observation. She thanked him. He left. She stood at the window and watched him ride away and understood that she had just been given something that had no monetary value and was worth more than everything else she had. She went back underground and worked for another 4 hours. The ventilation system took 3 nights to build and was the finest thing she had ever made. The intake conduit ran 50 feet from the cabin, buried 18 inches below the frost line, constructed of flat limestone pieces fitted together in a rough pipe shape, and then packed around with the dense clay she had been excavating. The joints were sealed with a mixture of clay and wood ash that she had found referenced in a letter her father had written to a friend about a particular sealing problem in the Cornwall method. She had the letter in the tin box with the money, had carried it west with her without knowing why, and now understood why. The conduit entered the stable chamber through the north wall at floor level, angled slightly downward on the outside end so that rain and snowmelt would not run in. The air entering the chamber had traveled 50 feet through earth that maintained a constant 55 degrees, which meant it arrived pre-warmed, not warm exactly, but stripped of the killing cold of the surface. In the stable, 3 horse bodies would contribute their own substantial heat, perhaps 1,200 watts of metabolic output between them, which would bring the chamber temperature to something genuinely livable. The exhaust was the more difficult engineering problem, and the one that she spent the most time on because it was the element that would determine whether the whole system worked or failed entirely. The exhaust conduit ran horizontally from the high point of the chamber's vaulted ceiling, moving through the earth on a slight upward grade toward the cabin's existing chimney. She had built a secondary passage behind the fireplace back wall, accessible from inside the chimney, clean out and visible to anyone who did not know to look for it, with a series of flat stone baffles set at angles that would deflect the stable's exhaust air into the main chimney flue above the level of the active fire. The principle was the same one her father had explained in the Mine Warm Air Rises. Fire creates draw, and the smell of living animals caught in that draw and passed through an active flame would be consumed or transformed into something that registered to an outside nose as wood smoke and nothing else. She tested the exhaust connection the same way she had tested the whole system integrity 2 weeks earlier. She burned horsehair in the chamber. She went outside and stood downwind for 20 minutes. The air that reached her carried the smell of burning pine and the mineral cold of the night. Nothing else. She stood in the dark and allowed herself for precisely the duration of 3 slow breaths to feel something that was adjacent to satisfaction. Then she went back inside and got back to work because satisfaction was the most expensive luxury a person in her situation could indulge in, and she could not afford it for longer than 3 breaths. The ramp was the problem that had kept her awake most consistently during the planning phase, and it turned out to be the problem that was hardest to solve in execution. A horse will go down a slope if the slope is gradual enough, if the footing is reliable, if the approach is calm, and if there is a compelling reason at the bottom. A horse will not go down a slope it cannot see the bottom of, regardless of how gradual it is, regardless of what is waiting for it, if the animal has decided the situation is wrong. Horses have survived for millions of years by trusting their instincts about spaces, and their instincts about underground spaces are uniformly and reasonably negative. She had designed the ramp as a descending spiral, starting from the concealed entrance in the brush 30 yards behind the cabin and turning 180 degrees over a horizontal run of about 40 feet to arrive at the chamber floor. The grade was 1 foot of drop for every 6 feet of horizontal run, shallow enough for a calm horse on good footing, steep enough to reach the necessary depth within the available horizontal space. The floor of the ramp was her most careful work. 6 inches of compacted sand tamped with the back of the mattock until it had the feel of packed earth rather than loose material. On top of that, a layer of pine needles gathered at dawn from the forest floor behind the cliff face and carried back in her apron in loads that took 20 minutes each way. The pine needles served 2 functions. They provided additional cushioning that would absorb the sound of hooves, and they provided grip on a grade that would otherwise be too smooth for a horse to descend confidently. She finished the ramp on the 19th day. It had taken 4 nights working entirely by feel in the lower sections where the candlelight did not reach, checking the grade with a length of twine and a small iron plumb bob that she had made from a wheel nut and a piece of string. She sat at the bottom of the ramp in the darkness and listened to the sound of the earth above her, which was the sound of nothing, which was exactly right. On the night of the 20th of October, with the deadline 24 hours away and a moon that was covering and uncovering itself behind moving cloud, she brought the horses down. She had thought about the order and decided on Gideon first. The buckskin was the oldest and the most settled in his temperament, not incurious but measured in the way that animals who have lived through enough variety develop a measured quality about new situations. He would go where she led him, provided the leading was done right. She brought him out of the corral at the back of the property just before midnight, moving slowly, her voice a continuous low murmur of the kind of nothings that horses find reassuring, not because of the words, but because of the consistency of the sound. She carried a cloth pouch of oats in her left hand, held at his nose level, moving it forward in small increments. The entrance to the ramp was screened by a stand of serviceberry brush that she had been careful not to disturb during the construction. She had widened the gap between the bushes enough to allow the horses to pass through in single file, and she had propped the gap open with two forked sticks cut from branches, which could be removed, and the brush allowed to spring back to its natural position in 10 seconds. Gideon stopped at the entrance. She did not pull. Pulling a horse forward into a space it is uncertain about is the most reliable way to confirm to the horse that the space is dangerous. She let him stand and she moved the oat pouch slightly forward into the dark of the entrance and she waited. He blew through his nose. His ears went forward, then back, then forward again, tracking the space, reading it with the acute sense of air pressure that horses use to understand the geometry of spaces they cannot see. The air coming out of the entrance was 55 degrees and smelled of pine and earth and nothing threatening. He took one step, then another. She moved with him, keeping the oat pouch at the right distance, close enough to hold his attention far enough ahead to keep him moving. She talked to him steadily, not urgently, just the regular sound of her voice in the dark, familiar and unchanging. They went down the ramp in 4 minutes. When his feet reached the flat sand floor of the chamber, and he understood that there was ground beneath him and ceiling above him, and walls on 3 sides, and enough room to stand comfortably, his whole body changed. She felt it through the lead rope, the specific release of tension that a horse's body makes when it decides the place it is in is acceptable. He dropped his head. He began to eat the oats from her hand with the focused, rhythmic attention of an animal that has settled. Pella came next. The bay mare was more sensitive than Gideon, but trusted Wren in the direct and total way that mares sometimes bond to the specific person who has handled them consistently. She hesitated at the entrance for less time than Gideon had because she could smell him below, and that was a more compelling argument than anything Wren could have offered. The colt was last, and the colt was the one she had been most uncertain about. He was 8 months old, and 8 months old is an age that combines the physical capability to cause serious damage with the mental development of someone who has not yet fully decided whether the world is trustworthy. He had never been in an enclosed space. He had never been below grade. He had never been asked to go somewhere in the dark that he could not see the exit of. She spent 20 minutes at the entrance, not asking him to move, just standing with him in the brush, her hand on his neck, the oat pouch producing its smell into the cold air. She let him hear the sounds from below, the quiet movement of Gideon and Pella in the sand, the low sound of their breathing. She let him smell the air, which was not threatening. When he moved all at once, the way young animals sometimes do, a sudden decision, all or nothing, no gradual negotiation. He went down the ramp in a rush that made her heart seize, but his feet found the pine needles and held, and at the bottom he pressed himself against Pella's side and stood there shaking for 30 seconds, while Wren came down behind him and put her hand on his neck and talked to him in the same unchanging voice. The shaking stopped. He dropped his head and found the oats she spread in the sand. She stood in the chamber for a long time after that, listening to the sound of 3 horses eating in the dark around her. The sound was regular and rhythmic and entirely ordinary. It was also the most beautiful sound she had heard in 3 years, since the last morning she had heard Ben's breathing in the bed next to hers before she woke to find it had stopped. She did not allow herself to linger in that comparison, but she noted it, and then she climbed the ramp, pulled the brush back into place, went inside the cabin and used the block and tackle system she had rigged from the ridgepole to raise the hatch boards from below and set them back into position in the floor. Then she laid the rug over them. Then she sat down in the chair by the stove and looked at the ordinary floor of her ordinary cabin, and listened to the faint rhythmic sound of 3 horses moving in the sand 8 feet below, which from a distance sounded like nothing at all, and from a distance of more than 2 feet was entirely inaudible. The deadline was in 24 hours. Cormac Whitmore arrived the following morning before 7 o'clock, which was earlier than she had expected. She heard his horse on the track and was standing at the stove with her coffee cup when he knocked. She noted that he had come alone. Harlan Voss was not with him. She noted that he had come early before the day had organized itself into its official character. She filed both observations. She opened the door and invited him in. He sat at the table and accepted the coffee she offered and looked around the room with his careful, non-intrusive attention. The room was exactly as it always was. The fire in the stove was modest and warm. The floor was undisturbed. There was no smell of animals, no evidence of unusual activity, no indication that anything in this space was anything other than what it appeared to be. He put his hand flat on the table surface and then, in a gesture that seemed almost involuntary, moved it to the floor beside his boot. He held it there for a moment. Then he sat back up. She watched him process whatever he had felt, which was a gentle, barely perceptible warmth in the floorboards, not dramatic, not inexplicable in the context of a heated cabin, but present in a way that a man with 58 years of physical attentiveness would register and file. His face did not change. His posture did not change. He drank his coffee. He asked her if she had the situation in hand. She told him she did. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who is choosing between 2 different ways of understanding what he is seeing and choosing deliberately, which meant he was choosing the interpretation that the evidence in front of him literally supported, rather than the interpretation that his prior expectations had prepared him for. He opened his record book. He uncapped his pen. He wrote in the measured hand she would later learn he had maintained for 30 years no livestock on premises. Property in compliance with the terms of Ordinance 14 Section 3, which requires removal or securing of livestock, constituting documented predation attractants by date of first hard freeze. As of this date, no livestock is present on the Aldridge property. He capped his pen. He told her that Harlan Voss would be by later in the afternoon with a formal inspection party to complete the official record. She thanked him. He stood up hat in hand and said one more thing before he left. He said it quietly and without looking directly at her, in the way that men of his generation say the things they mean most seriously sideways, almost as though the statement is made to the room rather than to the person in it. He said, "Whatever you've done here, Mrs. Aldridge, make sure it holds." Then he put his hat on and left. Harlan Voss came at 3 in the afternoon with 2 men from the Territorial Council office and his ranch hand Decker. He was in the kind of mood that powerful men enter when they have been anticipating a satisfying resolution to something and are beginning to suspect the resolution is going to be less satisfying than they planned. He dismounted and walked the perimeter of the property first. He checked the corral, which was empty and had been swept clean of manure. He checked the lean-to behind the cabin, which contained firewood and tools and nothing else. He walked the ground around the cabin with his eyes down, looking for the kind of evidence that a man his age and experience knows to look for: compressed earth, where weight has been concentrated, disturbed ground, fresh, digging, the smell of animals in enclosed spaces. The ground told him nothing. He came to the front of the cabin and looked at Wren, who was standing on the porch with her coffee, having come to the same conclusion she had reached on the morning he had delivered the ordinance, which was that the most powerful posture available to her was simple stillness. He asked her where the horses were. She told him they were no longer a concern for the council. He looked at her for a long time with the flat, evaluating gaze of a man accustomed to being the smartest person managing any given situation. Then he looked at the ground between them. Then he looked at the cabin behind her. He went inside without asking. She stepped aside to let him. He walked the length of the main room. He looked at the fireplace, which had a modest fire and a pot of beans warming on the crane. He looked at the table and the 2 cups. He looked at the floor, which was covered by the rug that had been covering that floor for 3 years. He stood in the center of the room and turned slowly, taking in the 4 walls and the ceiling and the 2 small windows and the total absence of anything that should not be there. He brought his boot down hard on the floor in the center of the room. Beneath the boards in the sand, 8 feet down, the colt flinched and shifted his weight. The movement made no sound that reached the surface. But for a fraction of a second, the floorboards transmitted the infinitesimal vibration of 600 pounds of young horse adjusting its stance. Harlan Voss stood still. He looked down. Then he looked up at Wren. She held his gaze and said nothing. The moment stretched out between them like a rope pulled from both ends, And then he made the decision that men like him most commonly make when presented with a situation that falls outside the categories available to them. He dismissed it. He chose the explanation that fit the world as he understood it because the world as he understood it was a tool he depended on, and he was not prepared to revise it based on a vibration in a floorboard. He told the councilmen to record the property as clear of livestock. He told them to note that without the means to support a working claim, which required horses in this valley in this season, the property would be subject to review under the abandonment provisions of the Territorial Land Act within 30 days. He was telling her that she had won one round and was going to lose the next one. She looked at him and said nothing because there was nothing to say yet. The next round would not be fought in October. It would be fought in the language that November spoke, which was a language that Harlan Voss's timber-frame, surface-built, wind-exposed horse barn was not equipped to understand. He left. She stood at the door and watched him go. Beneath her feet, she could feel the faint warmth rising through the boards. The system was working. The chamber was holding temperature. 3 horses were standing in the dark below her, breathing clean air, eating good hay, their body heat rising through the earth into the floor of the cabin where she stood. The trees along the ridge to the west were already stripped of their leaves. The sky to the north was developing the particular gray-green quality that the old-timers described as the color of a hard winter deciding to be serious. She went inside. She built up the fire. She sat down and did the final calculations on the grain supply, how much she had, how long it needed to last, how to ration it against the duration of a winter that the sky was already telling her was not going to be short. She was ready. The valley was not. The first real warning came not as wind, but as silence. On the morning of the 14th of November, the birds stopped. Not gradually the way they thinned out through October as the season progressed, but all at once between 1 hour and the next, as though something had issued an instruction that every living creature with wings understood immediately and acted on without deliberation. Wren noticed it while she was splitting wood at the side of the cabin. She set the axe down and stood still and listened to the absence of sound, and the absence was so complete and so sudden that it had a physical quality like pressure changing in a room when a door closes. She looked at the sky to the north. The clouds there were not the gray-green she had been watching for 2 weeks. They had passed through gray-green and arrived at something darker and more deliberate, a bruised purple-black that sat on the top of the northern ridge like a physical mass, something with weight rather than just color. The light under it was the particular yellow-gray that occurs when a sky is simultaneously blocking the sun and reflecting snow that has not yet fallen. She had 6 hours, maybe 8. She went inside and built the fire up to the maximum draw the chimney would support, then went below through the hatch to check the chamber. The temperature in the stable had stabilized at 63 degrees over the preceding 2 weeks. 8 degrees above the Earth's base temperature, the difference generated by 3 horse bodies working continuously as metabolic furnaces. The hay was adequate. The water delivered each evening through a stone-lined channel she had cut from a spring feed on the north side of the property was running clear. The horses were calm. She checked the ventilation baffles in the chimney connection. She checked the intake conduit at its entry point into the chamber wall. She ran her hand along the vaulted ceiling of the main chamber, checking each stone for movement, pressing upward at the keystone positions to feel the resistance. Everything held. She climbed out, sealed the hatch, and began to prepare the cabin for what was coming. By 4 in the afternoon, the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. By 6, it had dropped another 20. The wind came in from the northwest at an angle that found every gap in every structure in the valley that had not been specifically designed to resist it, which was most of them. Wren could hear it working at the corners of her cabin, a high searching sound, like something looking for a way in, and she sat by the fire and listened to the structure around her creak and settle and hold, because Ben had built it solid, even if he had not built it, with the understanding she now had of what the ground beneath it could do. The snow began at 7 and was serious from the first minute. Not the light exploratory snow of early season, but the committed load-bearing snow of a winter that had been building itself in the high peaks for weeks and had finally decided to deliver. It came horizontally in the wind for the first 2 hours, accumulating not in even layers, but in the drifted, compacted masses that form when precipitation and wind work together. By 9 o'clock, Wren could not see the fence posts of her corral through the window. She kept the fire at the level the system needed, not large enough to be wasteful, not small enough to reduce the draft that was pulling the stable exhaust through the baffles and up through the flue. She had calculated the wood consumption, and confirmed she had sufficient supply stacked under the lean-to accessible through the rear door of the cabin without requiring her to go into the open. The floor was warm beneath her feet. She pressed her soles flat against the boards and felt the even steady warmth rising through them. Not the sharp heat of a fire, but the deep, sustained heat of living bodies below the metabolic output of 3 horses, converting hay and oats into the thermal energy that was keeping her floor from freezing from underneath, while the temperature outside descended toward levels that had no interest in human or animal survival. She made coffee. She checked her calculations one more time, not because she doubted them, but because checking calculations is what you do when you are responsible for something that cannot afford to be wrong. She read for an hour by candlelight a survey pamphlet on soil composition that she had borrowed from the land office in August and never returned because the land office was run by a man who did not deserve it back. At 11 o'clock, she heard the wolves. They came down from the northern tree line in a pack that she estimated from the sound at between 25 and 30 animals. She heard them cross the upper grazing meadow. The sound of that many animals moving across compacted snow is distinctive, a rhythmic compression that carries a long distance in still, cold air. Then she heard them reach the valley floor and spread out, and the sound fragmented into individual movements that she tracked by ear as they worked the property. She did not go to the window. She did not need to. She understood exactly what was happening outside because she had designed this system specifically for this moment, and the design was either adequate or it was not, and looking out the window would not change which one it was. What she did was close her eyes and follow the logic of the air. The intake conduit was pulling outside air from its buried entry point 50 feet north of the cabin, drawing it through 50 feet of earth-tempered conduit at a rate driven by the pressure differential between the cold surface and the warmer chamber. The air arriving in the stable was stripped of the killing cold, but also stripped of the information-carrying capacity that the wolves were relying on the scent molecules that ride in cold, still air and can be read at a mile's distance by a nose built over millions of years, specifically to read them. The air going into the chamber was clean. The air coming out of the chamber carried the horses, their breath, their body heat, the specific biochemical signature of 3 living equines in an enclosed space. This air rose to the top of the vaulted chamber and entered the exhaust conduit and traveled horizontally through the earth toward the cabin chimney, and at the junction it was deflected upward through the baffles into the active flue, where the draft caught it and pulled it through the fire. What came out of the chimney stack was smoke. Oak and pine smoke carrying the invisible traces of 3 horses transformed by fire into something that registered to the outside world as nothing more than a cold woman burning wood against a cold night. She listened to the wolves work the property. She heard one stop directly outside the cabin wall. She heard it, the particular sound of an animal going still. The cessation of that rhythmic snow compression replaced by nothing. Just presence. A nose working the air outside her wall, 4 inches of log and clay plaster between the animal and the woman sitting by the fire, 8 feet of earth between the animal and the horses it was looking for. She held her coffee cup with both hands and did not move. The wolf moved on. She heard the pack work the entire perimeter of her property over the next hour, moving with the focused, tireless efficiency of animals that are genuinely hungry and genuinely cold, and have come down from the high country because the high country had run out of the margin they needed to survive. They were not random. They were systematic. They checked every structure, every fence line, every corner where a thermal signature might pool and betray what was inside. They found nothing at the Aldridge property. At 12:30, she heard the pack consolidate and move south along the valley floor, heading toward the Grafton spread, where she knew the horses were in a timber frame barn that had been built to the old standard and ventilated in the old way, a hay door in the gable end, and a gap under the eaves that moved air efficiently and broadcast what it contained to anything within half a mile that was equipped to read it. She heard the change in the pack's movement when they reached it, the acceleration, the purposefulness. She did not go to the window. She put another piece of oak on the fire and went to bed. She woke at 5 to the sound of something at the front door. Not knocking, not the sound a person makes when they intend to communicate. The sound of a person who has been in the cold long enough that the ordinary mechanics of knocking have become difficult, a heavy irregular impact, the sound of a gloved fist that is not working properly. She dressed quickly, pulling her coat over her nightclothes, and went to the door. Harlan Voss was standing on her porch. He was not the man who had ridden up her tracks 6 weeks ago with his documents and his witnesses and his precise impersonal authority. He was a man who had been outside in minus 30-degree air for long enough that his face had gone the specific color that faces go when the blood is retreated from the surface in earnest defense of the core. His coat was wrong too thin for what the night had become. His gloves were wet. He was holding the lead rope of a single horse, a gray gelding she recognized as one of his better animals, and the horse was shaking in the specific continuous full-body way that a horse shakes when it has been cold for so long that shaking has stopped being a response and started being a state. Behind him, barely visible in the driving snow, were two figures she identified as Decker and the man from the council office. They were on foot. She understood from this that they had lost at least 2 horses to the night. She stepped back from the door. He came in. He stood in the center of her main room, and the cold came off him in a wave that the fire pushed back against, and he stood there looking at the room with the eyes of a man who has just spent several hours being instructed by reality in the difference between what he believed and what was true. His timber frame barn had failed. She did not ask him this. She knew it the way you know things that the evidence makes unmistakable. The barn had been built to the standard. His own ordinance specified the standard he had demanded she meet, the standard he had used as the mechanism of her dispossession. Double-wall timber frame, registered construction regulation hardware. It had been built above ground, exposed to the full force of a wind that had come in at 40 miles an hour, carrying snow with the density of wet sand. The double walls had provided insulation until the moisture in the wood had frozen, at which point the insulation value had dropped precipitously. The doors had drifted shut and then frozen in their frames. The ventilation gaps had become the channels through which the wolf pack had read the location of every animal inside. He had lost most of them. The number did not matter yet. What mattered was that he was standing in her cabin with 1 surviving horse and 2 surviving men, and the particular expression of a person whose model of the world has been revised by events. She put the kettle on. She did not say anything to him for a long time. There was nothing to say that the night had not already said more efficiently than she could. Decker and the councilman came in and stood near the door, taking up as little space as possible, in the way that people do when they understand they are in a place on terms that have not been negotiated. She handed them each a blanket from the chest near the window. She pointed Decker toward the lean-to and told him there was a stall space he could rig for the gray gelding out of the available materials, not warm enough for a long stay, but sufficient for the night if the animal was blanketed and the door was sealed. Decker went without speaking. Cormac Whitmore arrived an hour later. He came through the door with the snow still on his shoulders and ice in the gray of his beard, and he stood in the middle of the room and looked at Harlan Voss, sitting at the table with both hands wrapped around a coffee cup. And then he looked at Wren, and then he looked at the floor. He put his hand down on the floorboards. He held it there for a long moment. He looked up at her. She looked back at him. He said very quietly, "It's breathing." The silence that followed had a specific quality. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say. The silence of people who are standing at the edge of something that requires a moment before it can be spoken. Harlan Voss set his coffee cup down. He looked at Cormac. He looked at Wren. He looked at the floor. He asked her where they were. She did not answer immediately. She stood by the stove with her arms at her sides, the same posture she had held on the morning he had come with his document and his witnesses. Feet at shoulder width, weight evenly distributed, the posture of a person who has decided that the ground beneath them is the most reliable thing available, even when that ground has not yet revealed what it contains. She crossed to the center of the room. She reached down and pulled back the rug. In the floor flush with the boards and invisible without the rug removed was the iron pull ring she had set into the hatch on the first night of construction. She had cast it herself from scrap iron using a form cut from clay and a fire built in the stone ring behind the cabin, a 2-hour process that she had done at midnight because daylight was not available to her for activities that could not be explained. She took the ring in both hands. The block and tackle system she had rigged from the ridgepole engaged with the quiet, competent sound of well-made hardware doing its job, and the hatch section's 6 feet of flooring cross-braced on the underside, with oak pieces she had mortised together without nails, rose on its leather hinges with the slow, weighted movement of something that had been built to last. The warm air came up first. Not dramatically, not a rush or a billow, but a steady, even exhalation of warmth that carried with it the specific layered smell of living horses in clean straw. Hay, oat dust, the faintly sweet muscular smell of large animals in good health, the mineral undertone of the clay walls and the sand floor. It filled the room. Cormac Whitmore took one step back, not in alarm, in the specific physical response of a person whose senses have just received information that their mind has not yet finished processing. Harlan Voss did not move at all. She picked up the lantern from the table, lit it, and held it over the open hatch. The light fell down through 8 feet of air and landed on the floor of the chamber below. And in that light, 3 pairs of eyes reflected back the calm, liquid, slightly startled eyes of animals who had heard the sounds above them and were now looking up at the sudden opening with the mild interest of creatures who have been safe long enough to be curious about surprises rather than frightened by them. Gideon. Pella. The colt pressed close to Pella's side, his coat glossy and dry. All three in good weight, all three warm, all three standing on clean sand in a chamber that was 63 degrees, while the world above them was trying to kill everything it could reach. Cormac went to the hatch and knelt at the edge and looked down for a long time. He did not speak. He reached out and gripped the edge of the opening and leaned forward, and she watched him take in the vaulted ceiling with its dry stacked limestone arches, the smooth clay walls, the ventilation conduit entering at floor level from the north, the exhaust channel exiting at the apex on the south side. He was a craftsman. He understood what he was looking at, the way a craftsman understands things not theoretically, but in his hands and in his chest, in the place where accumulated skill lives. He straightened up and looked at Harlan Voss. When he spoke, his voice had the quality of a man who is choosing his words with the care that the moment requires, which is the care you apply when you understand that what you say next will be remembered. It's not a hole in the ground, he said, and it's not a stable, not in the way we've been using the word. He paused. She built a mine for the living, and it held through the worst night this valley has seen in 20 years. The silence after that had a different character than the silence before. Harlan Voss stood up from the table. He walked to the hatch and looked down at the 3 horses looking up at him. He stood there for a long time. She watched his face and saw the thing that she had been waiting to see, which was not defeat in the dramatic sense, not the collapse of a man's will or the visible crumbling of his certainty. It was something quieter and in some ways more final. It was the expression of a man who has just watched his primary argument walk away from him on its own legs. He could not confiscate these animals. They were the best sheltered horses in the Redstone Valley on the worst night the valley had produced in a generation. The ordinance he had written and deployed as his instrument specified that livestock must be secured against predation and weather in an adequate structure. There was no adequate structure within 20 miles of this cabin tonight, except the one beneath his feet. He turned to the councilman, who had been standing near the wall since coming in from the cold, saying nothing, watching everything with the careful, non-committal attention of someone who understands that what they are witnessing will need to be reported accurately. He started to say something about registered structures, about the specifications in the ordinance, about the process for official recognition of non-standard construction. Cormac Whitmore set his record book on the table. He uncapped his pen. He said without looking up, "I've been writing down what I see for 30 years, Harlan. I've never written down anything I didn't see, and I've never failed to write down anything I did." He began to write. He wrote for 2 minutes in the silence of the room with the fire crackling in the stove, and the warm air rising from the open hatch, and the smell of living horses filling the cabin. Then he stopped and looked up, and he turned the book so that Harlan Voss could read what he had written. She did not read it from where she stood, but she saw Harlan's face as he read it, and his face told her what it said without her needing to see the words. He sat back down. He picked up his coffee cup. He looked at the floor, the open hatch, the light falling down into the chamber, the 3 pairs of calm eyes below. He said nothing else about registered structures or ordnance specifications. The councilman, after a moment, took out his own record book and wrote something in it. She did not see what he wrote either, but he wrote it with the expression of a man who has understood that the position he is recording is the position of the evidence, and the evidence has made itself clear. By morning, the storm had dropped 3 feet of dry crystalline snow across the valley floor and another 18 inches on the slope above it. The wind had stopped sometime before dawn, and the silence that replaced it was the deep, padded silence of a landscape that has been thoroughly covered and is now resting under its own weight. Wren opened the cabin door at first light and looked at the world the storm had made. The corral fence was buried to the top rail. The lean-to had held, though the roof was carrying more snow than it had been designed for and would need to be cleared before midday. The track down to the main road was invisible, indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain. The creek was silent under its new covering. She looked at the chimney. A thin column of smoke rose from it into the absolutely still air, straight up, undisturbed, carrying its invisible cargo of filtered horse breath into the cold sky, where it dispersed into nothing. She went back inside and began the work of the morning. Harlan Voss and his men stayed through the first day while the road was impassable. She fed them from her stores with the efficiency of a woman who has calculated exactly how much she can give without compromising the margin she needs to keep. She did not speak to Voss more than the practical minimum. She did not gloat. Gloating was a form of spending, and she had learned to be careful about what she spent. On the second day, the road was sufficiently packed by the cold to allow passage, and Voss left with his gray gelding and his two men. Decker looked at her when he went past, and there was something in his expression that she had not seen from that particular direction before. She noted it and filed it without elaborating on it. Cormac Whitmore stayed. He stayed because he had questions and because he was a craftsman. And craftsmen do not leave the presence of work they don't understand without asking the questions that the work raises. He spent 2 hours below in the chamber with a candle examining the construction in detail. He traced the ventilation conduit from its entry point to the chimney connection. He pressed his hands against the vault of the arch and felt the quality of the load distribution. He checked the ramp, running his palm along the sand and pine needle surface, testing the grade with his body's own sense of angle. When he came back up, he sat at the table and opened his record book and looked at her. He asked her to explain it to him. Not the broad outline. He had understood the broad outline from what he had seen. He wanted the specifics, the depth calculation, the frost line reasoning, the ventilation physics, the arch geometry, the ramp grade. She explained it. She explained it the way her father had explained things to her, in the precise, specific language of someone who is talking about physical reality, rather than concepts, using the vocabulary of materials and forces and measurements, because those were the terms in which the problem existed and in which the solution had been found. He listened without interrupting. He took notes, not summary notes, actual dimensional notes with sketches, the kind of notes that a craftsman takes when he intends to be able to reproduce something. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at what he had written. Then he said, "This needs to be in the record." She told him it could go wherever he thought it should go. He said it needed to be in the territorial construction record, the official one, as a documented method with documented specifications, not as a curiosity or an exception, as a standard. He looked at her steadily when he said the next thing. He said, "It will need your name on it." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the fire in the stove. She looked at the floor above where her horses were standing in the warm dark below. She thought about the tin box behind the chimney stone with $11.40 in it. She thought about the survey pamphlet from the land office. She thought about the paper on which she had done her calculations, the back of Harlan Voss's ordinance, which was now the foundation document of the thing she had built. She told him to write it up however the record required. He wrote for a long time. She put more coffee on and did not interrupt him. When he was finished, he turned the book and pushed it across the table to her. At the top of the page, in his measured hand, he had written Frontier Substable Standard Aldridge Whitmore Method. Redstone Valley, Colorado Territory, November 1878. Below it were the specifications, the depth ratios, the arch geometry, the ventilation calculations, the ramp grade, the frost line reasoning, everything in the precise language of practical engineering. At the bottom, 2 lines for signatures. His name was already there. She picked up the pen. She had not written her name in an official document since she had signed the homestead claim 3 years ago, and that had been a document that required a widow's signature, a signature that existed in the context of loss, that derived its legal standing from an absence. This was different. This was a signature that stood on its own, that derived its standing from what she had built, from what she knew, from what had held through the worst night in 20 years. She signed it. Wren Aldridge. Not Mrs. Ben Aldridge. Not the widow. Not the woman with the homestead claim and the 3 horses and the $11. Just Wren Aldridge. The name she had been born with. Her father's name. The name of a family that had understood for 200 years how to find in the earth the things the surface could not provide. The winter that followed was long and serious and killed a significant number of animals in the valley. The substable system was not the solution to every problem the season presented. It was a solution to a specific set of problems: predation, extreme cold, structural failure under snow load, and it worked within those parameters with the reliability of something that had been designed rather than improvised. By February, when the worst of it had passed, and the days were lengthening back towards something that felt like a future, Wren had lost none of her horses and had kept them in condition that a spring working season would make use of. The grain calculation had been tighter than she had planned for, but the horses had come through it. The community's accounting of the winter was done in losses. The Grafton spread had lost 4 horses. The Kemper operation had lost 7 head of cattle to wolf predation in a single night. The stage line's Redstone feed station had lost its entire hay supply when the storage structure failed under the snow load, and the resulting disruption to the winter schedule had cost the operation significantly. Harlan Voss had lost 11 horses and most of his winter cattle. The number was reported in the spring council session with the neutral precision of accounting, but it carried a weight that accounting cannot fully contain. He had been the man who set the standard. He had been the man who had built to that standard, and the standard had failed. He did not attend the spring council session. In March, when the first real thaw softened the track and made travel practical again, people began to come to the Aldridge property. They did not come with the tone of people paying a social call or offering belated sympathy. They came with notebooks and measuring tapes and the specific focused attention of people who need information that they did not have before and have identified the source of it. Wren received them the way her father had received questions in the mine, with patience and precision, and the understanding that knowledge is only valuable when it is accurately transmitted, because inaccurately transmitted knowledge gets people killed underground and does the same thing above ground if the underground is what you are building. She showed them the chamber. She explained the arch geometry with the physical objects in front of them, demonstrating with her hands why the angle of the Springer stones was not arbitrary and what happened when you got it wrong. She walked them through the ventilation logic slowly enough for the logic to land. She gave them the frost line calculation and explained where the number came from and how to verify it for their own land, which would not be identical to hers. She did not charge them for this, but she did not perform it with sentimentality either. She was not gracious in the way that people who are doing a favor are gracious. She was specific and clear and expected them to pay attention, and when they did not, she repeated herself once and then moved on. By the following autumn, 7 operations in the valley had begun excavation on substable systems. The proportions varied. The Kemper operation built a chamber nearly twice the size of Wren's because they had more animals, but the principles held across all of them: frost line calculation, arch geometry, ventilation physics. The same logic applied to different ground. Harlan Voss sold his operation in late 1879 and moved south. She heard this from Cormac Whitmore in a letter that arrived in October, written in his measured hand, passing along information without editorializing. She read it once, put it in the tin box, and did not think about it much afterward. His departure was not a victory she needed to celebrate. His departure was simply what happened when a man's model of the world stops matching the world. By 1895, the Aldridge-Whitmore method had been formally incorporated into the territorial construction standards for high-altitude ranching operations. The citation in the official record was precise and unembellished. A method developed in the winter of 1878 in the Redstone Valley demonstrated to reduce livestock mortality during extreme cold events by a factor that the available data supported. The names attached to it were the names on the original record book entry. Both of them, in that order. Wren expanded her own system twice over the years, first to connect the stable chamber to a root cellar, then to incorporate a spring-fed cooling room that maintained near constant temperature for food storage through the summer. The thermal logic was the same in all 3 applications. The Earth's constant temperature below the frost line, used as a resource rather than a barrier. The same principle her father had explained to a 12-year-old girl in a Pennsylvania copper mine, using the vocabulary of physical reality, because that was the vocabulary the physical reality spoke. She lived in that cabin for 40 more years. She outlasted the sawmill and the stage line and the territorial council in its original form, and most of the men who had looked at her in that October and concluded that the arithmetic of her situation was not survivable. She did not outlast the mountains. Nobody does. When the cabin was finally demolished in the mid-20th century to make way for a county road improvement, The crew foreman stopped the work when his equipment encountered something the survey had not indicated. He climbed down from the machine and walked to the edge of the excavation and looked into it. The chamber was intact. The vault of the limestone arch had not shifted. The clay walls were smooth and uncracked, holding the compression of 70 years of overburden, with the same calm adequacy they had held the weight of the first winter's snow. The ventilation conduit was clear of debris. The sand floor had compacted over the decades into something nearly as solid as the clay walls, but its composition was unchanged. The crew foreman was a practical man who had spent 20 years working with foundations and substructures, and he stood at the edge of that chamber for a long time before he said anything. What he said when he finally said it was addressed to no one in particular. He said that whatever they put back down there after the road was done should be built the same way, because whatever had built this had understood something about the ground that most people who work above ground never bother to learn. The chamber was documented, measured, and photographed before it was filled. The photographs went into the county historical record. The measurements confirm what the original calculations had established. The arch geometry was within 2 degrees of the theoretical optimum for dry stack limestone under clay overburden. The ventilation conduit alignment was precise to the angle specified in the record book entry that Cormac Whitmore had written in November of 1878. A bronze marker was installed at the road margin when the construction was complete. It was a modest marker, the kind that marks a site of historical or technical significance, without making claims about the people involved. It listed the dates, it listed the method name, it listed the principal dimensions of the chamber. It listed the thermal efficiency of the ventilation system as calculated from the original documentation. It did not mention a widow. It did not mention a 21-day deadline or an ultimatum delivered on a cold October morning by a man on a black gelding with a weak left foreleg. It did not mention what it cost to build the thing by hand alone in secret, by candlelight in clay that had to be cut rather than dug. It listed what the structure was and what it had done and how well it had done it. Because in the end, that is what remains. Not the struggle, and not the grief, and not the specific texture of a night when the wolves are working the perimeter, and the fire is the right size, and the floor is warm beneath your feet, and 3 horses are breathing in the dark below you, alive and safe, and hidden from everything that wants to take them. What remains is the measurement, the dimension, the angle of the arch and the depth of the frost line, and the physics of warm air rising through cold earth toward a fire that transforms what it receives and releases something clean. The numbers do not lie. They do not grieve. They do not forget. They simply hold. The way good ground holds, the way a well-built arch holds, the way a woman holds when she has decided that the thing beneath her feet is the most reliable foundation available, and she has done the calculation, and the calculation says it will be enough, and she picks up the mattock and begins.